New York City has a new mayor, and in his first 6 months in office, he's already delivered on some of his biggest campaign promises. A 2-year rent freeze on nearly 1 million rent-stabilized apartments, a new tax on luxury second homes, and a housing agenda that's reshaping how landlords, buyers, and sellers across Queens need to think about real estate. If you own a multifamily home in Queens, or if you're a rent-stabilized tenant, or you're thinking about buying a 2 to 4 family property in the next year, the rules of the game just changed, and a lot of people have not caught up yet. I'm not here to tell you whether these policies are good or bad. I'm here to walk you through exactly what has changed, who it affects, and in the back half of this video, where I'm seeing opportunity for buyers because of all of this, let's get into it. I'm Maureen Folan, the queen of Queens real estate. I've been selling real estate for over 30 years, and I know this market. I've sold over 1,600 homes, and I've seen how the landscape of real estate has actually changed. So let's talk about it. What has actually changed? The rent freeze explained. Let's start with the headline policy. In June 2026, New York City's Rent Guidelines Board voted a 7-to-1 freeze rents at 0% for both 1-year and 2-year leases on rent-stabilized apartments starting October 2026 through September 2027. This is the first time in the board's history that a 2-year lease has ever been frozen at 0%. 1-year freezes have happened before, but never alongside a 2-year freeze. This affects roughly 1 million rent-stabilized apartments all across the 5 boroughs, and housing estimate of over 2.4 million New Yorkers. In Queens specifically, that includes a meaningful share of the borough's older multifamily buildings, generally buildings with 6 or more units built before 1974, plus buildings receiving certain tax breaks or subsidies. The mayor appointed 6 of 9 board members earlier this year, and this freeze fulfills one of his central campaign promises. It's worth noting that the board's vote wasn't unanimous. One landlord side board member resigned the morning of the vote, saying that the outcome had been decided before the board even reviewed its own data. Real estate industry groups have criticized the decision and are expected to challenge it in court. Hey, I wanted to share something for free. I prepared a home seller preparation checklist for residents of Queens and Long Island. This guide will give you everything you need to know about preparing your home for sale. So if you click on the link below in the comments, you'll download your own copy for free. Or if you visit maureenfolan.com, you'll be able to get your seller checklist there. So thank you so much, and let's get back to it. The property tax picture. The rent freeze isn't happening in isolation. It's paired with an evolving property tax story. Earlier in 2026, the administration proposed a 9.5% property tax increase all across the 5 boroughs as a last resort revenue measure. That proposal faced immediate pushback, not just from real estate interests, but from progressive housing advocates who pointed out that how unevenly the current property tax system already falls on different neighborhoods. By May 2026, that broad increase had been shelved, though not formally withdrawn, in favor of a more narrower approach. A new tax on a Pied-à-Terre properties, meaning that luxury second homes owned by non-residents worth more than $5 million. That surcharge went into effect July 1st, 2026. It's a much smaller scale tax that mostly touches ultra-luxury Manhattan real estate rather than typical Queens housing stock. But it signals where the administration's revenue priorities are heading, and it's something worth watching whether some version of a broader property tax conversation resurfaces in the future budget cycles. The bigger housing agenda. Beyond the freeze and the tax fights, the administration has also announced a 5-year, $22 billion housing commitment aimed at building and preserving affordable housing, expanding housing vouchers, and streamlining the zoning and permitting process through a new task force focused on speeding up approvals for new development. There's also been continued advocacy, separate from anything the mayor controls, for expanding rent stabilization eligibility and pursuing what's been called universal rent control, though those larger changes would require approval from New York State, not just City Hall. The bottom line on the policy landscape, some of this is already locked in and affecting Queens property owners right now. The freeze most directly. Other pieces are still proposals, working their way through Albany or the City Council, and could look very different by the time they're finalized. Section 2, the Queens Landlord Dilemma. Here's where this gets very real real for a huge number of clients. Queens has one of the largest footprints in the city of small to mid-sized landlords, people who own 2 to 4 family homes, live in one unit and rent out the others as a core part of their retirement or their household income. This is not Wall Street investors. These are often working and middle-class homeowners who bought a 2-family in Flushing or a 3-family in Bayside decades ago, specifically because the rental income helped them afford their mortgage and their taxes. For rent-stabilized units, that rental income is now frozen for the next 2 lease cycles, meaning the cost of actually operating these buildings keeps climbing. The Rent Guidelines Board's own price index, the research arm of the same board that approved the freeze, found that the cost of operating buildings with rent-stabilized units alone rose 5.3% this year alone. That's property taxes, water, sewer rates, insurance premiums, heating, fuel, and labor costs, all moving upward while the revenue side of the ledger sits flat. Insurance, in particular, has been one of the fastest rising costs for small multi-family owners across the city over the past several years. Premiums climbing well above general inflation, driven by rebuilding costs, litigation trends, and reduced insurer appetite for older multi-family stock. When you stack rising insurance, water rates, and property taxes on top of a rent line that legally cannot move for 2 years, the math on owning a small multi-family property gets a lot tighter than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. Here's the counter argument for balance. To be fair to the other side of this, tenant advocates and the administration point to data showing that under the prior mayoral administration, rent-stabilized rents rose by a cumulative 12% over 4 years, while landlords' net operating income across the stabilized housing stock rose by roughly 30% over that same stretch, suggesting that even with the rising costs, ownership of these buildings has generally remained profitable overall. A report from the anti-poverty group Robin Hood also estimated that rent regulation has kept roughly 140,000 New Yorkers from falling below the poverty line, and the city's own affordability survey found that more than half of renters are spending 30% or more of their income on rent. So there's a real well-documented affordability crisis on the tenant side of this equation too. This isn't just a story about how landlords getting squeezed with no context. I'm not going to tell you which side of the debate is right. What I will tell you is what it means operationally for a Queens property owner trying to plan the next 2 years. Here's the exit strategy wave. Here's what I'm watching for and what I'm already starting to see conversations about. A wave of casual, middle-class landlords deciding that owning a multi-family rental in this environment isn't worth the headache anymore. These are owners who were never full-time real estate investors to begin with. They inherited a 2-family home from a parent, or they bought a 3-family 30 years ago as a practical way to afford Queens home ownership. When rents are frozen for 2 years and every other cost keeps rising, some of these owners are simply deciding to sell rather than keep absorbing the squeeze. I want to be careful here. I don't have hard data yet showing a mass exodus, and it's still early. The freeze does not take effect until October of 2026, but in the conversations I'm having with owners of 2 to 4 family properties across Bayside, Flushing, Fresh Meadows, Whitestone, there's more openness to selling that I've seen in years, specifically among owners who are on the fence anyway, and for whom this policy shift tips the scale. If you're one of these owners and you're thinking through whether you hold or sell, that's exactly the kind of conversation I'd love to have with you directly, because the right answer depends heavily on your specific building, your tenant mix, and your financial picture. The buyer opportunity. Flipping the script. Now here's where I want to shift the tone of this video, because everything I've covered so far sounds like bad news if you're a property owner. But if you're a buyer, particularly a traditional end user buyer looking at multifamily homes in Queens, this same set of policies may be creating some real opportunity. Here's the logic. Professional investors, the kind who buy multifamily buildings purely for the cash flow and appreciation, often at scale, are more sensitive to regulatory uncertainty than an end user buyer who wants to live in one unit and rent the other out. When a major city imposes an unprecedented 2-year rent freeze, some of that institutional and semi-institutional investor appetite for multifamily acquisitions in New York City cools off, at least temporarily, while everyone waits to see how the policy plays out, including the pending legal challenge to freeze itself. and what a cooling investor market means for you. When investor enthusiasm pauses, even temporarily, it changes the competitive dynamic for a Queens 2 to 4 family listing. Historically, an end user buyer, someone who wants to occupy one unit and rent the others to help cover the mortgage, has often had to compete against cash-heavy investors who can move faster, waive contingencies, and absorb more risk. If a chunk of that investor pool steps back from the table because of their uncertainty about the future regulation, that opens up real buyer negotiation, room for a buyer who's planning to live in the property themselves. This is a genuinely different dynamic than what I described a few weeks ago when I talked about Long Island's inventory crunch. Multifamily properties in Queens operate on a different logic than single-family homes on Long Island. That buyer pool includes investors who explicitly do the math on rent rolls and cap rates, and anything that makes that math murkier tends to soften investor demand faster than it softens demand from someone who just wants to own a home with a rental unit attached. What to actually do with this information? If you're a buyer considering a multifamily purchase in Queens right now, here's how I want you to think about it. Run the numbers assuming the freeze holds for its full 2 years. Don't underwrite the purchase assuming rents on any stabilized units will increase anytime soon. Even if the legal challenges succeed, you don't want to be relying on that outcome. Ask hard questions about the current rent roll. Understand exactly which units are stabilized, what they're currently renting for, and what your actual cash flow looks like under a frozen rent scenario for 2 full years. Under the softer, use the softer investor competition to negotiate. If professional investors are pulling back, sellers may be more receptive to a fair offer from an end user buyer than they were 18 months ago, when they might have had 3 investor offers on the table within a week of list. Factor in the possibility that some of these could change. The rent freeze faces pending legal challenge, and larger pieces of the broader housing agenda still require state approval. Buy based on today's rules, but stay informed, because the regulatory picture in New York City multifamily real estate has been unusually fluid this year. So here's where things stand. The new administration has followed through on a signature campaign promise with a historic 2-year rent freeze, paired with a more narrow luxury property tax and a much larger affordable housing agenda still working its way through Albany and City Hall. For Queens landlords with rent-stabilized units, this means real, immediate cost pressure with no corresponding revenue relief for the next 2 years. For buyers, especially end users looking at multifamily homes, it may mean less competition from professional investors and more room to negotiate than we've seen in a while. If you own a multifamily property in Queens and you're trying to figure out whether you hold, sell, or restructure how you're managing it under this new rent environment, that's exactly the conversation I have with homeowners every single week. Drop a comment with your building type and neighborhood, and I'll give you my honest read. And if you're a buyer wondering whether now's the moment to get into multifamily property while investor demand is softer, I want you to subscribe, because I'll be tracking exactly how this plays out as the freeze takes effect in this October. I'll see you in the next one.